I want to get your perspective on how significant this is, because I think the first thing many people will be concerned about is this going to be the first of many, or is this an issue that you can really reasonably isolate to Skye Bank in terms of weaknesses?
So, I'd say, so for Skye Bank, I'd say it's been long coming, and more because we haven't seen numbers from the bank since the audited 2015 numbers. So I wasn't necessarily surprised, but I suppose the issue was really more, and because we hadn't seen the numbers as well, consistently you've been seeing reports from the NSE asking for an extension and saying extensions were granted. And if you look at, I suppose your second question of is it an isolated position or could there still be other challenged banks? I think if you look at reports published by the central bank, NDIC on asset quality of banks and capital adequacy ratio, I think it's still clear that there's still a few, in their words, small banks that have such challenges. I think there was a number that showed that aggregate capital adequacy ratio for these banks were as low as about 3–4%. So I think there's clearly an issue. But I'll say what's positive about this sector and the situation right now is that unlike the challenges we had in 2009, where a number of large banks, so top 7, top 8 banks, had such massive asset quality and capital adequacy ratio deficiencies. This seems to be not the case in the sense that the larger banks that account for about 80% of total sector assets, seem to be in a much stronger position.
I guess that is the big difference between now and, say, 2008, 2009. It's the big banks appear to be in a relatively good position. But then I think another very interesting dynamic about this story, and I tweeted about it over the weekend, is that we have Skye Bank that acquired a bridge bank, Main Street Bank, and now that bridge bank, and that Skye Bank has now become a bridge bank, Polaris Bank. Does AMCON have the capacity, though, to recapitalize this institution right now? Because there have been question marks about AMCON's capacity after all it had to do the last time, and it still really hasn't come out or exited many of its investments from that round of buying of bad loans.
I suppose that's clearly a challenge and a question. And I know in the past when we've interacted with AMCON as well, there's been questions around AMCON being in a position to buy bad loans from the sector, and their own position was that they've stopped that process or have gone past that process. And you might argue that maybe for Skye Bank or Polaris Bank now, the difference might be that it's possible that the reasons why there wasn't a resolution was because the shareholders likely weren't comfortable with valuations and so on. And I think for me, particularly when you consider that the central bank still maintained the management team and was confident in their position, in their performance so far, and for me that demonstrates that the central bank and that the management team seems to be making efforts to address the capital position. And with the bridge bank now, I think what it's done is to take out those shareholders, and I suppose the conversations should be relatively smoother or easier now, particularly if they are shareholder or if they're interested investors sitting out there to buy out those banks. And if you think about AMCON's challenges as well, they've been able to exit all the banks that they own shares in the past, and I would argue that this should be a reasonably smooth process as well. And I suppose the areas that they have challenges with seem to be in the aviation and other sectors as well.
So clearly the CBN did take its time on this one, judging from the fact that history for us on this, clear history in the open starts from the 4th of July 2016, where we began to see resignation by the chairman, all non-executive members of the board, and then coming up with issues of inability of the bank to recapitalize itself. Let's take a step backward and try to understand the CBN's takeover strategy for the bank. Now it says AMCON will capitalize Bridge Bank and then begin process of sourcing for investors. How easy, how much of a walk in the park would that be, if it would be at all?
So if you think about the last institutions that AMCON was able to sell, so I think there was Main Street, Keystone, and those, in my view, demonstrate the capacity to do that. And so So it clearly won't be a seamless or easy process, more because of where valuations are. And I suppose valuation will be the big question. So if you look at the banking sector, look at the smaller banks, valuations are depressed. And so if AMCON, and so I suppose it's depending on AMCON's own overall objective. If it's for profitability, which I suppose was more the shareholders' position, then it might be a much more difficult position. But ultimately, my own view, it's really more about the price. So depending on how desperate AMCON is to exit that situation, I'd argue that it shouldn't be too much of a difficult process.
Right. And in the press release, the CBN said the bank's performance has improved considerably compared to where it was pre-July 2016. So clearly it was a case of the, if you like, old shareholders of the defunct Skye Bank not being able to come to the table with fresh capital. Are you surprised that that was the case, or do you think that the challenges with the former Skye Bank were so significant that it may have been a case of pouring a lot of money into a big hole? What do you think?
So for me, I think it's difficult to answer that question, more because we haven't seen numbers since 2015. So, and if the central bank thinks and sees that there's been a positive position, then, and I suppose shareholders as well haven't seen numbers. And so maybe that's also why you haven't seen such a move as well. And I would say over the years, there hasn't necessarily been any announcement of the bank trying to do a rights issue, for example. Because you'd argue that that could be a first step whereby existing shareholders could decide to recapitalize the bank. So we didn't hear, there was no news or announcement on that. And then also, we haven't necessarily heard of any interactions with potential investors. Right? It's likely that was happening, but I suppose that the valuation could have been the question. But I think in terms of shareholders recapitalizing, the first step could have been a rights issue from existing shareholders.
Now, once this news broke, one of the first few thoughts that would pop in your head is you would recall the consolidation of the banks years back. And when the CBN cites issues of corporate governance and inability to recapitalize, do you think this is a signal for the CBN to begin to look a little closer at the operations within the banking sector?
So I'd say the central bank has been looking very closely at operations of banks. And for Skye Bank, I think part of their challenge was high exposure to the oil and gas sector. So oil and gas sector accounted for well over 20% of the loans of the banks. With the crash in oil prices and challenges in that sector. And I think that was one part of the big challenges, and that's what really drove the high loan loss provisions for the institution. So you can argue that risk management systems clearly need to be improved upon. I suppose for the oil and gas sector, because it was new to the Nigerian banks as well, this was part of the learning process, which maybe ultimately led to material losses from a bank like Skye Bank. But I think ultimately with banking, ultimately you'd expect that over time the regulator continues to refresh how banks are regulated, what's critical to look at, particularly as the economy evolves and changes as well.
And of course, there's some closure in terms of the fate of the investors in the bank, because unfortunately they've lost all their money. With this move by the central bank, there's no going back. It's all gone. And many investors in the banking sector will now begin to think that, especially with those smaller banks that are listed on the stock exchange, how concerned should I be about my investments? What would you say to those type of investors right now? Is there a greater risk investing in smaller banks today, or would you say that this Skye Bank situation is like an outlier? There's not much to be worried about.
No, I think ultimately what this means as well for shareholders is that they should be intentional with ensuring that they have the right management teams, right board members, and hold those board members accountable. I think that's part of the point Central Bank has made in previous interventions as well, that ultimately they're far more concerned about depositors not losing money. And for shareholders, you should interact more with your board members and management teams, go to AGMs, ask stronger and much more difficult questions, and hold management to account. And so, for me, I think that's more the lesson. And to your point, I think what this also demonstrates and shows is that as an investor as well, you have to look at the quality of the company you're investing in, look at the quality of the board, quality of the management team as well.
But